Russia's invasion of Ukraine is at the forefront of European Union's citizens' minds, with defense and security seen as key issues ahead of the European Parliament's term.
Joining us right now is Roger Hilton, Defense and Security Research Fellow, Globsec. Since 2019, he has worked at Globsec in Bratislava, Slovakia, where he is currently a media presenter and defense fellow. Thank you so much for joining.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Now, for the last time tonight, I think I have to make a disclaimer. Now, for another 20 minutes, we are restricted by election silence. Therefore, we cannot refer to political parties, their agenda, and as well the polls. Now, we are in a very particular and vulnerable moment. We have war right outside of our borders. Now, what challenges will the new European Parliament face when it comes to defense and deterrence?
Well, as you said, it's very difficult right now to assign what the policy priorities will be of certain parties. But I think if you look at the grand scheme of the international landscape, Europe's strategic autonomy and how they work with NATO is one major issue. To date, NATO and the European Union have agreed on 74 points. So working together, I think, is the first priority that the new Commission and the new Parliament will look at, because a strong NATO and EU partnership is the basis for looking outwards. You have issues like great power competition. You have a lot of political unpredictability, and I think otherwise, when it comes to much younger voters, is climate change, climate security, and how to respond to climate disaster.
So as we're looking at the political climate, the political landscape ahead, and during the EU parliamentary elections, there's definitely a polarization that's visible. How do you see the divisions within the Central and Eastern European area play out after this election?
It's kind of hard to comment without the results coming in, but obviously when you look at the V4, the Visegrad 4 countries, you have some countries who have really thrown much more support behind Ukraine, and others who might be a little bit lukewarm, despite all of them being inside NATO. You look at the example of the Czech president, Peter Pavel, who's the former NATO chairman, who has really spearheaded a lot of efforts about finding ammunition for Ukraine. And as I said, Poland, with the new change of government, has also sort of taken a much stronger support, although just for the record, Poland has been unbelievably supportive of Ukraine throughout the entire process. But it still remains to be seen how the end of the election will yield the final policy when it comes to security and big security issues when it comes to Ukraine.
Well, exactly. I want to talk about Ukraine. As you mentioned, there's polarization. But how do you think Europe and European members, all the 27 countries, how are they going to tackle this issue of polarization? Because right now, Ukraine needs unity and solidarity. And we can sense from the last 5 years of EP term, it didn't work. What do you think will happen right now? How are these MEPs, new MEPs, are going to tackle that issue?
I think the first thing is everybody is absolutely sick and tired of Russia's war against Ukraine, with the number one people who are paying the highest price and being the most fatigued with it, Ukraine. And it's unrealistic to think, given how long the war has going on, that there's not some sort of voter fatigue a little bit. Ukrainians are paying the highest price in terms of the blood that their citizens are paying to defend their country and keep to keep Europe safe. But when it comes to Europe, I think they have to be constantly reminded that while the war is still going on, it's absolutely essential moving forward that they are still providing financial aid and military aid, because at the end of the day, this is still a great deal for Europe, for NATO, and for the European Union to be supplying all of this support for Ukraine as it defeats or as it fights Russia, as well as Ukraine's trajectory towards joining the European Union and NATO eventually.
So when we talk about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and Europe's support for Ukraine, we also have to mention Hungary, because Hungary's been blocking aid for Ukraine a number of times before. It is definitely a pro-Russian voice in Europe, and it takes the EU presidency in July. Let us not forget that very point. How do you think this fact is going to actually affect the decision-making in the EU structures?
Well, I mean, given with what I've read and sort of the analysis that's out there already, I mean, I think a lot of the big, most important milestone decisions under the current Belgian presidency are being rushed to try to get done before July 1. But obviously, Viktor Orban has made no surprise, of his discontent at the moment when it comes to supporting Ukraine on military aid. And yes, it will be a massive issue that, for the 6 months starting on July 1, Hungary will have the EU presidency and they'll be able to dictate the agenda. But as we've seen as the war has gone on, there's been a lot of different coalitions of countries, whether it's in North America and Europe or different pockets of Europe regionally, who have come together to support it. So while there could be other countries that would be leading it in a much different way than Hungary when they have the EU presidency, it's not to say that this is a total blanket on other activities. And leading up to the NATO summit in July, I think a lot of activity will continue despite the Hungarian presidency.
Mm-hmm. Now, another issue we would like to discuss with you is cybersecurity, hybrid war. That's because we're talking about war in Ukraine, foot on ground, full-scale invasion, but also we are dealing with hybrid war. What did European Parliament, European Union in general already do when it comes to this issue, and what do you think they should do in the future?
It's such a complicated subject, sort of the ongoing sub-threshold tactics that Russia is deploying. And, just before I came on right now, the idea that there's been this 24-hour window within the Czech Republic in Prague about public transport is just an example of how it is. A lot of the security is done on the member state level when it comes to the EU. And I think, at the most recent NATO ministerial in Prague, they've spoken about it. They have the NATO defense ministerial coming up. But I think every country will have their own strategy. But the most important thing that will link it together is, sharing intelligence, sharing lessons learned. And I think it's acceptable to accept that a lot of the intelligence agencies across Europe have had this type of plan in mind already. So while up front right now, Russia, it looks like, has been quite successful in a lot of sabotage really across Europe, I think gradually intelligence agencies, EU member states, NATO, and the EU collectively will come together and get this under control a little bit better than it is at the moment.
And following Anya's question and what you said just now, I wanted to refer to what we spoke about to our previous guest, because we obviously focused on economy, and defense and security is directly related because of the financial reasons. So obviously it is the decision of the member states of how much GDP they're going to put into defense spending. But is there a way that the new EU structures, the new European Parliament is actually going to influence them or try to maybe convince them to spend more in order to up the security and defense as well as deterrence within the region?
Of course, I mean, Europe in general, a lot of the member states are going through a very tough economic situation, whether it's the cost of living, stubborn inflation. The most important message first for policymakers to communicate is that we wish there was a different situation where we didn't have to invest so much money in terms of our defense, but it is necessary. I think in terms of the mechanisms or the way in which the EU can incentivize member states to do it, one great way to look at it is on dual-use technologies. Obviously, these new emerging disruptive technologies are really at the forefront. Until contracts are signed, I don't really expect there to be a lot of revamped European industrial policy when it comes to legacy systems, old artillery systems across Poland, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. But I think gradually we'll see what the outcome of the results are, but I still think that this is going to be a forefront issue of the new parliament, regardless of its political composition, and whether or not they want to accept that these threats will continue to come at Europe. Climate change is an agnostic threat that affects everybody. As we saw this week in Europe, southern Germany, Baden-Württemberg, and Bavaria were underwater. You can expect forest fires to be coming as well. So with or without the EU and its parliament taking action, these threats will continue to manifest and only grow unless the EU grows a stronger strategic autonomy and works more with NATO.
But just to your point, just how far should European members work together when it comes to defense and defense spending, taking into consideration their own needs, and they need to secure their own countries. They will have to spend a lot of money, and they are actually increasing the amount of money spent on defense. How far do you think they should cooperate when it comes to defense?
Well, obviously, from a basic economic perspective, it makes a lot of sense for smaller countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, to pool resources together and work on much larger systems. there's no one country or even a combination of countries in the EU that can replicate the type of defense production that the United States puts together. So as I said, I mean, whether it's the Baltic states working together or smaller pockets in Central and Eastern Europe, or those in the Benelux, it makes a lot of sense as much as possible to scale up projects together to share burden, and as well, shoot for targets where there's no duplication, where there's coordination with the European Defence Agency in Brussels, as well as the policy planning unit at NATO.
Well, thank you very much for shedding light on this issue. Roger Hilton, Defence and Security Research Fellow at GlobSec, thank you very much.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you.